Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our next speaker, Mr. Oliver Harrop.
Thank you. Thank you. All right. The problem with political parties. When asked about the upcoming election, who he was voting for and why, Byron Merrill, my sage religion professor, simply yet profoundly said, "I don't look so much at parties as I look at people and principles." I scribbled this little quote down as soon as I heard it. It gave me chills. As he went on to describe how he has never voted strictly along party lines throughout the course of his life, which, to give you a point of reference, began roughly in the late 1800s, and has always looked at the qualities of candidates, I began to think to myself, I wondered why this wasn't the case for the majority of Americans, and how we as a country have become so rigidly divided along party lines. As I mulled over my thoughts for a few days, I reached a conclusion. America's two-party system should be abolished, and we should replace it with a new system, perhaps a multi-party system, a one-party system, or one in which no parties exist at all. Now, I know you might be thinking, that's a really bold claim. And you know what? You're right. I mean, our country has always had a two-party system, beginning with Federalists and Anti-Federalists, and maturing to the modern-day competition between the Republicans and Democrats. That's the way things have been for the first 244 years of the United States' life. So you may be thinking, why change it? We're already set in our ways. There's no changing the current system. Well, I'm going to leave that up to you. I'm not here to propose what we should do to solve this issue. I'm only here to help you realize that there is in fact a problem, nay, a plethora of problems, with the current two-party system. I will also present a couple potential ways we could go about reshaping the political landscape of our country that I have found throughout my research. As you are all painfully aware, polling to determine who will win the presidential elections is closed, and the process of counting and recounting the ballots has begun, and it looks as though Joe Biden is going to win. We have all had the opportunity to vote for the candidate we felt is best suited for the job, but there's a small problem. I didn't see any option for president that I felt was best suited for the job. I have yet to see a Twitter post about how qualified and intelligent either of the candidates are. In fact, social media has been absolutely blowing up over the past few weeks because of the election. I have seen some posts that are quite disturbing and in some cases violent, including one I saw on Snapchat just a few days ago that suggested if Biden wins the election, quote, there are people planning to mass murder people of color and members of the LGBTQ plus community, close quote. Regardless of the truth or falsity behind this statement and others that have been made, the feelings of resentment and hatred towards the other side sickens me. After all, are we not all one country? Do we not all pledge allegiance to the same flag, waving o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave? After watching our country for the past several years, I'm not too sure. While we were watching the election results coming in, one of my buddies said, how is our country divided so perfectly? It's like half of the people are on one side, half on the other. This constant battle for control over branches of government is yet another toxic side effect of political division. Up on the screen are charts illustrating political division in 1994 and 2017.
There's 1994, and there's 2017.
It's not very hard to notice just how much that median Democrat line has shifted away from the median Republican line. It is equally easy to notice how far away from the middle these lines have grown compared to how close they were back in 1994. This article, America's Political Divide, also provides some other staggering statistics, such as, quote, 95% of Republicans are now more conservative than the median Democrat, and 97% of Democrats are more liberal than the median Republican. Compared to the respective 64 and 70% from the 90s, it's easy to see how much the divide has grown. Because of these newfound extremes, quote, virtually nobody in America is happy with the politics of the present age, quote. Everybody wants something to change, although those things may differ greatly between parties and people. The problem is, nobody can agree on what needs to change or how this change is to happen. Lee Drutman, senior fellow in the Political Reform Program and author of Breaking the Two-Party Doom Loop, suggests that the problem with American politics is that, quote, the two major political parties are locked in a zero-sum game, neither willing nor able to compromise, unquote. We have all seen and experienced the effects of this. Drutman claims that if it would be ideal if we would transform our two-party system into a multi-party system. That way voters would have more than just two seemingly opposite alternatives and would not be subject to choosing the lesser of the two evils. Since there would be more choices, it would actually be possible to choose a candidate that one felt was best suited for the job. Because there would be more competition and each candidate would be standing on their own platform without an entire political organization backing them up, it would truly be an examination of principles and ideologies. There wouldn't really be any opportunity to put party before country, as Todd Fry of the Times Republican says American citizens do far too often. He also suggests that real change and progress can be made if all politicians had to run as independents and when in office, vote on the matters we face on behalf of their constituents' best interests, instead of pushing their own personal and partisan agendas. In preparation for this conference talk, I watched a few TED Talks to gain some knowledge on this topic from academic sources. The first person I learned from was Keith Payne, a social psychology professor at the University of Nevada. He described in detail the research he and his colleagues conducted about the social psychology of believing you are poor or believing you are rich. In their experiment, they gave two equally sized groups the same amount of money for doing the exact same amount of work. Then, they told one group they were above average in their labors and thus had earned more, and the other group that they were below average and thus they made less. In reality, both groups made the exact same amount of money and had done the same amount of work. This had some interesting results. In 10 minutes, Keith said, the people in the above average group cultivated ideals that were previously thought to form over a lifetime. That is to say, quote, this is fair. We should cut taxes on the rich and cut benefits for the poor, make them work for it, have a free market, etc. It is because of this seeming inequality that a division between the two groups grew so rapidly and deeply. As Keith said later in his talk, as inequality has risen in recent decades, political polarization has risen along with it. This cause and effect here is interesting, but simple and logical. The inequalities of our nation are what makes the political divide so great. Later, he said that we see those who disagree with us as idiots or as immoral. Nearly half of Democrats and Republicans now think that the other side is not just mistaken, but is a threat to the nation. And that animosity prevents us from finding the common ground to change things. He goes on to claim that the only way that we can do anything about our politics is to fix our inequalities. Those in the seeming above average group need to humble themselves, for they have the power and the responsibility for kickstarting the process of finding common ground. Now let me remind you, I'm not here to propose any one thing that we should do about these problems we face. Rather, I am merely a facilitator to get us all thinking about the possibilities and the alternatives to our current faulty system. The second talk I watched was given by Eric Lee, a political scientist. He described his experiences growing up in Revolution-era China and later as a Berkeley, California hippie. Both of these ideologies, of which he was a part, had similar meta-narratives. While growing up in China, he was taught that human civilization progressed in a linear manner. We started as primitive societies, progressed from slave societies into the current socialist and capitalist factions we have today, and the end goal in this progression is communism. Once we arrive there, we will all live happily ever after. But until then, it's a battle between good and evil. The good of socialism against the evil of capitalism. In Berkeley, he learned a completely new one. Also linear, this one claimed that human society must move from groups being the basic units of humanity to atomized individuals being the sovereign units. Once everybody in the world is given the ability to vote, they produce good government and live happily ever after. But before we get there, it's a struggle between good and evil in which those with electoral democracies attempt to spread their ways across the globe, sometimes by force. This time, the Chinese didn't buy that narrative. Although the rise of electoral democracies has been exponential over the past 3 decades, the Chinese did their own thing and were run by one party, the Chinese Communist Party. And in just 30 years, China went from one of the poorest agricultural countries in the world to its second largest economy. 650 million people were lifted out of poverty. But how can this be? China didn't follow either of these seemingly one-size-fits-all meta-narratives, yet enjoyed more success than most electoral democracies put together. Later in his talk, Eric explains that the idea of linear progression for humans is ridiculous. We can't expect all of humanity to end up at the same point and to have the same exact way of doing things across the board. That is one of the main points of his talk, to convince the people of America that a two-party system, an electoral democracy system, isn't the only right way to do things. In fact, it very well may not be the best way to do things. Here are some of the positive aspects that having one single party could bring. First, it is very adaptable. Although political reform in a single party would look very different from a two-party system, it has been shown to be more fast and efficient by China in their one-party system. They have undergone massive changes, such that the way the government is run, from the local to the national level, now is unrecognizable from what it was 30 years ago. To prove this point, Eric said he would venture to suggest that the party is the world's leading expert in political reform. Additionally, people claim that in a one-party state, power gets concentrated in the hands of the few and corruption follows. However, the opposite is true. The party happens to be one of the most meritocratic institutions in the world today. Less than 20% of those at the top of the Chinese government, those in the Politburo and the Central Committee, which is 325 people, come from backgrounds of privilege. Less than 20%. Everybody else came from completely ordinary backgrounds, and all of them had to work their way to the top. So moral legitimacy in the system is high, and only the best of the best get into office. Here's how the system of government works. It operates on a rotating pyramid made up of 3 parts: civil service, social organizations, and state-owned enterprises, like schools, universities, etc. Through a complicated and rigorous system, people in all 3 parts of this pyramid are promoted into higher and higher levels. Those who are superior end up in the top 300 people in this pyramid. This process takes 3 decades. Patronage, of course, plays a role, but merit remains the driving force behind it. To give you a reference point, out of the millions upon millions of Chinese employees out there, only 900,000 get promoted to just the first level of advancement. Then 600,000 to the next level, 40,000 to the next, and 300 at the very top. Eric pointed out that George W. Bush or Barack Obama, quote, would not make even a small county manager in China's system, unquote, let alone become the leader of the country. Throughout the remainder of his talk, Eric goes over other aspects of the Chinese model of politics that seem to be desirable compared to the two-party system. Democracy is becoming a perpetual cycle of elect and regret, he said, as approval ratings drop under 50% in just a few months after an election, and officials aren't voted out for another 4 long years. However, he does not claim that this model of government is the best, nor does he say that it should be applied to countries across the globe. He merely states that the meta-narrative of democracy being the only way for government to be run is false. There are other alternatives out there, and this is just another one that works. The last speech I watched was given by Jonathan Haidt and was titled "The Moral Roots of Liberals and Conservatives." He begins by talking about the 5 foundations of morality: harm, fairness, authority, in-group, and purity. As he conducted a survey among liberals and conservatives on how much they value these things, it was found that both liberals and conservatives value harm and care and fairness very highly. However, liberals don't really care about authority, in-group, and purity as much as conservatives, and don't really consider them to be moral. Liberals say, let's celebrate diversity, question authority, and they say, keep your laws off my body. Liberals speak for the weak and the oppressed. Conservatives speak for the institutions and traditions. These differences in what is perceived as morality is what leads us to the political divisions we have today. Liberals and conservatives both have things to contribute. One speaks for the weak and the oppressed, and seeks change and justice, while the other speaks for institutions and traditions and wants order, sometimes at the cost of those at the bottom, and yet they fight against one another. Haidt describes how all the gray Asian religions have attained balance, in which opposites don't fight against each other, they work together. Look at the yin and yang. They don't hate each other, they aren't enemies, they both need each other like night and day. This same principle is expressed in Hinduism and Buddhism. They have gods called Vishnu, the preserver, who can be viewed as the conservative god. They love order, and Shiva, the destroyer, who can be viewed as the liberal god who loves change. The Chinese philosopher Cenzanne said, "If you want the truth to stand clear before you, never be for or against." The struggle between for and against is the mind's worst disease. He suggested that we all take a step back from the seeming battle between good and evil and instead seek for truth. That is the only way that we will be able to make progress as a country and set aside our differences. As the great George Washington once said, however political parties may now and then answer popular ends, they are likely in the course of time to become potent engines by which cunning, ambitious, and unprincipled men will be enabled to subvert the power of the people and to usurp for themselves the reins of government, destroying afterwards the very engines which have lifted them to unjust dominion. Unfortunately, this is what our political system has resorted to. However, there are ways for us to change that. In this talk, I have presented some potential things we could do to solve this issue of political division. One idea is that we could have a multi-party system, one in which many parties exist. Another is that we could have a one-party system. And another is that we could have no political parties at all and have candidates run by themselves without a party behind them. But as I said, I am not here to decide which one is to be implemented, if any at all. I'm going to leave that up to you. Thank you.